Cool. Well, thank you all for coming. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Nelson. I grew up sailing around Cotuit, and I spend my time mostly out of Cotuit these days, in places like this, although not all the time. And I'm here today to share some photos and a little bit of storytelling from a recent trip I did up with some friends to Alaska. This is me and said friends. I can give a little bit of background on the trip. If you can see my cursor there. I flew up from Arizona to Seattle, and we flew from Seattle to Juneau, which is down here in Southeast Alaska. Can everybody see? Does that all work? And so my buddy and I, Toby, who's actually on this call right now, we went up together and spent a couple weeks in Southeast Alaska climbing with a friend of ours before we headed up north to the sort of main objective of our trip, which was to climb in the Brooks Range, which is this dark zone up here in northern Alaska above the Arctic Circle. This is a shot of Southeast Alaska, of climbing on the coast down in Juneau. A pretty dramatic scene on its own, sort of big glacial fed fjords and big cliffs coming out of the ocean. And it was, a pretty stellar way to spend a couple of weeks. This is the zone that we were climbing. There's a lot of fishing boats, like you can see in the foreground there. So it was us up in this lighter zone over here, was where we were climbing. And on the right down here, there's actually a gull, like a seagull rookery and colony. So there's this constant sound of seagulls, which was very dramatic. And then fishing boats below the whole time. Also, just sort of wanted to keep this informal. If you got a question or something like that, you want to clarify, you don't understand what the heck I'm talking about, just, throw it out there or raise your hand or whatever.
We want a boat.
We did have to take a boat to get out there. Yeah, which made it really cool. You can't drive to it. This is Toby and my buddy Dylan, who was our host, doing some rock climbing. It was a pretty dramatic scene just above this teal blue water. And we pretty much had the place all to ourselves, except when some of Dylan's friends would show up to climb with us. It was pretty cool rock. You can see the intrusions, the dikes of quartz that make these spidery lines in the rock. And it was beautiful. We got Dylan to show off his no hands rest while he was climbing one of his new routes that he had put up. He was very proud of that. So I obliged him with a photograph. The highlight though was eating fresh shrimp straight out of the water there. They threw a shrimp pot in and we pulled it up and made a fire out on the beach and just cooked some shrimp on a hot rock. And that was about the freshest seafood I've ever had. And it was pretty fun. So after a couple of weeks of that, I kind of want to focus on the second part of the trip because this was much more a really big deal for me. We flew from Juneau, which is this first star, up to Fairbanks, which is this one over here in the middle, already pretty far into the Alaskan interior. But from there, we hopped in my buddy Logan's truck, who's a geologist living in Fairbanks, and drove up to this star, which is Coldfoot, Alaska, which I don't really think qualifies as a town. There's like maybe a half dozen people that live there, probably more if you actually are from there and you know what you're talking about. I don't. But it's this dramatically small little place for which we took a very small plane to this zone, which is where we're getting dropped in a smaller zone called the Arrigetch within the Brooks Range. This felt like a really big trip for me because I'd never been dropped off by a bush plane, and I've never quite been that far in the backcountry. And there was just a number of firsts, never been north of the Arctic Circle, etc. So it felt like there were a few novel aspects to this trip, just in the amount of logistical planning that went into it, and so on and so forth. So these are my three buddies, Toby, Casey, and Logan. And it was a really good number because that was how many people we could fit into this little plane. We had 1,000 pounds of cargo capacity. It was a very expensive plane ride. So we wouldn't have been able to, it was a $4,000 plane ride. So we would not have been able to do it just two of us. And it was already pretty expensive for the four of us. But that would get us into this area for 9 days. sort of self-supported, and just the context of the logistics makes it pretty exciting. This is our pilot, Dirk, who we were sure to spend every usable second picking his brain, because he knows that area just like the back of his hand. And it was really amazing being able to spend time with him. And, you know, once you get your headphones on in the plane, I was sure to grill him with questions and use every bit of knowledge he could give us. And it was pretty dramatic just flying in there. Like I said, I'd never been in a plane that small. Actually, I had, but not in this context, not deep in Alaska. What's that? This was August. This was August. So we knew that going into a place like this as a climbing trip, because we're rock climbing and that was our main objective, we had no idea what the weather conditions would be like. And to go on a climbing trip like this, you have to be prepared to not climb, to do all the effort, spend all the money, travel the whole way there, and then not get good weather, not get good climbing conditions. So that was sort of part of the mental prep, in addition to logistics, is getting ready to potentially not have it be successful. And we got pretty close to it not being successful. This is a little video of us landing on the gravel bar. Yeah, I was pretty psyched to have the front seat for that one. And then, of course, let's see. The big turning point. Okay, come on, computer. There we go. The big turning point for the trip is when he takes off again and leaves you there. Then you know the trip is sort of beginning in earnest. And that's just a sort of a particularly exciting moment. You know, all of your preparation is done. You're there. Suddenly it's really quiet, and you get to follow through with all the things that you've been thinking about doing for months and months. This, yeah, that's right. This is a view from a high point that we will achieve later on, but you can see basically our approach. Down here is the river where we were dropped, and this is our hike in. It was about 12 miles up this river valley, and it was some of the harder hiking I've done, partly because we were carrying quite a fair amount of weight between climbing gear, 9 days of food, you know, sleeping, camping gear, warm clothes, because we ended up getting sort of the gamut of weather conditions. How much do you reckon it was? We know to the ounce, basically, because of our limit. Each of our bags weighed about 80 pounds. And I had another 10-pound camera bag. So I was carrying like about 90 pounds, which is generally more than I can stand lifting. So doing that for 12 miles was a bit taxing. This is just a view of the same zone. We got dropped down here, and these are the two sort of zones that were our objectives. Xanadu is one of the major features in the region, and you can see this ridge coming off of it. This is a formation called Albatross, and we would make camp just below Albatross. And this here, this is Aquarius Valley, which would be the second zone that we would explore during our time up there. Oh, this is a picture of a nice little flower, but sort of describes some of the terrain as you're leaving the river valley, the main riverbed. So this is just puddle, and the grass will grow in these tussocks and these little mounds that make it quite difficult to walk on, because you're trying to hop from like pile to pile, and then you slip through and fall in the big puddle up to your knees. So that made the first bit tricky, but then there actually is a trail that was originally a game trail, but this is one of the more visited zones in the region, and it's actually been sort of tramped down into a trail, although the hiking was still a bit taxing.
You have to get a permit and give them your plan and your.
Yes and no. They don't actually, it's a national park. The Brooks Range is part of a national park, but they don't charge any entrance fee. But they do ask that you sort of sign in and check in your plan with them. And they want to know, your details about what your expedition is. They won't go looking for you though. If you don't come back out, they just assume you forgot to check out. So it's sort of you're on your own, and any fallback plan is on you to put together.
And which park were you in?
Gates of the Arctic. Gates of the Arctic National Park. Yeah, it's big. It's beautiful. It's like, for a little context, the Brooks Range is contained in Gates of the Arctic for the most part, and you could comfortably hide Italy within the Brooks Range. So it's quite a large range, and we were in a very small zone of it. Here's a picture of the Arrigetch Creek that we basically followed up the valley. One for a landmark that we'll come back to is this formation on the skylines called the Elephant's Tooth, which would sort of figure prominently in some of our adventures. But this is sort of the terrain that we're looking at before you get into the Alpine. You're hiking through sort of a low forest, and visibility was one of the concerns because part of our anticipation was bears. I'd never been in grizzly bear country. I spent a fair amount of time and anxiety trying to prepare myself for, and learning about what to do about this. But if you can see, we got this fine fella down here. So basically on our first day, we got to see a grizzly bear, which was sort of like the much anticipated highlight of the trip. Actually, he's looking pretty plump, which is about everything you want. And seeing a bear in August after he's had a couple months to eat is apparently a much more relaxing experience than potentially seeing one in June when they get out of hibernation and are quite hungry.
Can you run very fast when you're
That's the one of the video is not supported. Oh, it's not developing one. Great.
Those ears, really different ears. Stuck one out.
So we were really psyched to see this guy and to see him from a distance. This was basically the ideal scenario, and we were really excited about that. You're required to use bear vaults or bear canisters, which are these nearly indestructible plastic things that are quite hard to take apart. And what he's looking at is drawn on the inside is a diagram of a triangle, which is part of the recommended sort of procedure, which is keeping your cooking area 100 yards from your food storage area, which is 100 yards from where you camp. So if they were to find your cooking area, because that's where the smells come from, they don't find your food. And if they find your food, they don't come stumbling into camp. And it's like learning a little bit about the procedures and how you're supposed to deal with that stuff did make the whole thing a little bit less intimidating.
Did you position yourself to be down?
We didn't have much choice in the matter because we were actually traversing a pretty steep slope. So it's like he's quite comfortable in this terrain. He can move very quickly. We are totally not that way. We're very heavily burdened. It's like you're supposed to hold your ground anyway. If you run, that's like they'll, that triggers a predatory response. So it's like it's your sort of up to your ability to keep track of your surroundings and be prepared so as not to have to run. So this is heading back into the Arrigetch Valley. We're starting to see these peaks come closer and appear, and we're starting to see these big rocks that we'd been drooling over and dreaming about for a long time. That one on the right is called Caliban. This is a beautiful granite formation that we basically camped underneath. The one in the middle is called Ariel. And this one on the left is called Xanadu, which is basically that mega peak that's sort of like one of the biggest ones in the zone. And this one before it, this is called Albatross, which is big, but it's sort of dwarfed by Xanadu by just the scale of it. This is where we made our camp. This is our cooking area. We put it up against that rock there for some wind protection, because that's sort of looking into the northwest, which is where the prevailing wind was coming from. That's the Albatross below it, and that rock saved us a lot of discomfort because the wind kicked up and we actually did get some snow, which was we knew that was a possibility. But to get snowed on in August makes it feel like you're in the Arctic.
What were the temperatures generally that you were hitting?
So we were hoping for the best, and we were told that you could get, balmy, sunny 80-degree days where you have to really work at staying hydrated. I would say our average temperature and conditions was about 35 degrees and drizzling. So we were happy to have every layer we packed. And at one point I was wearing pretty much everything that I'd packed. This was from one of the days that the sun actually graced us with its presence. It only was there for about an hour, but we were thrilled. Drying our tents out, drying ourselves out. We were pretty psyched. Of course, the clouds moved in, not long afterwards. But just seeing the place illuminated was pretty dramatic, and we were gotten pretty high spirits, as you can imagine. We carried basically no water. There's a lot of glacial runoff. There's glaciers above and around you. There's creeks running everywhere. Like you basically, it's uncommon to go a few hundred yards without crossing a small creek. A lot of precipitation. And so that was great because we wouldn't have been able to carry that much water anyway, just by the weight of it. So just to give you a sense of the geology, my buddy Logan, it was really a pleasure being with him because he's a geologist, and he would just point stuff out that we wouldn't have seen. One of the things being, you can see how some of these rocks are dark and some of them are light. The granite's actually light colored, and the dark is generally lichen that grows on it. So when you see boulders like this, that means that they haven't been there that long. And we are not that close to the base of the mountain, like hundreds of yards. And so you can tell that those had fallen off the mountain and rolled down there. But it was also like the best place we could find in the flattest place to put our tents. So we discussed the probability of more of those coming down. We decided that we were probably okay, which was indeed the case. So because it wasn't that dry and we were getting regular precipitation, the rock was not going to be dry enough for our first few days to do any climbing. So we proceeded to just explore. And we did see other people up there who were just backpacking. We were the only climbing party that we encountered. And, we tried not to be disappointed. And I think that sort of mental preparation of, we can go all the way up there and there's a good chance we won't climb, put us in a good, mindset to just explore this incredible place and, move light and just get around a bit. And it was spectacular. Just the scale of these mountains. That's like a 2,000-foot vertical granite face in the distance. And it's really hard to sort of get a sense of the proportions and the angles of things, whether something is really steep or what. So just moving around in the place, you go a few hundred yards in elevation gain and everything looks different. You get a totally different view of the formations. And so we spent a lot of time with a climber's eye looking for what we might be able to climb when the conditions would permit, but also just so psyched to be running around in a playground like that. So that's this incredible lichen. I've got some close-ups later on, but one of the most fascinating things was the flora that would develop in these Arctic zones. Is just all types of lichen, and all of that orange in the bottom right is just lichen growing on there. And Logan's knowledge of glaciology along with the geology was fascinating as well. you can see how there's just this sort of basin made by those, that's called terminal moraine. So that's basically rock that's deposited by the receding glacier. And so just seeing how much geological activity was happening was fascinating for us to sort of get a sense of how active this landscape was. This is just, one of the glacial runoff creeks that we had to just, cross to get places. And my buddy Logan didn't actually bring a water bottle for most of it. He just had a little tin cup. And so he would just stop every time we cross a creek and just, have a cup of water out of it. Well, that was one of our big questions going in there is would we need to filter it? And a friend of ours who guides up there said, don't waste the space in your backpack on a filter because there's so little human impact up there, and even animal impact that like the water's, hasn't even been melted off the glacier for that long. And it was crisp and delicious, which was just really nice. So we had some fun sort of cruising around the valley. Here's a view from inside that upper basin. Xanadu and the albatross are behind me, and I'm facing into this basin. And you can see, these aren't huge glaciers by glacial standards, but for, New England boy, they're enormous. And you can also see that there's all of this rock, but what we were to learn is that you see these little holes where it's been active and there's a glacier just peeking out there. And that's what's called a rock glacier. As it's receding, the rocks are being deposited on top of it as well. But this is basically all glacier underneath these rocks, which was pretty fascinating to learn. You can also see how bright that lichen is. It felt like a pretty dramatic scene. And looking up at the mountains, this is often what the view would look like, just swirling clouds as we're trying to look for what might be climbable. This is looking down towards the albatross as we were trying to scope out something that we might be able to climb. It doesn't look quite as big from this angle, but that's probably 1,000-foot formation from that aspect. And there's actually a really beautiful crack that we found going up this buttress of it, but it did not seem like it wanted to be climbed that day. It was a little bit wet. We also had a bit of a close call with a rock fall event, which was a nice reminder of some of the objective hazards in this sort of terrain. And of course, you're acutely aware of any objective hazards that you can't, mitigate because there's not really any quick or any reliable way to get rescued or evacuated. So you feel like you're pretty on your own, which is pretty much the case. A rescue would be days out at best.
What did you bring in terms of like medical supplies?
We had small kits. Like climbing tape is sort of essential. And I ended up rolling my ankle from an old injury and I was able to tape it up to give it some more stability, stuff to do basic cuts and scrapes and disinfectant. But, there's a lot of creativity. It's like you're more likely to have, a rolled ankle or something like that. But, part of it is that would any injury would complicate things. So prevention is the best medicine. But we did have a satellite device to be able to call for something like that. So that's the albatross in front of Xanadu. I was really, really just enamored with the albatross. I really wanted to climb on it. We wouldn't end up doing that, but it was really a pleasure to just get to see it wearing these different sort of faces of the weather and the light and seeing it from different angles. It was a really beautiful place to just, be a spectator. Here's Toby checking out some of the lichen and wildflowers and stuff.
So was Toby there long enough to have lichen grow on his jacket?
I'm sure his beard's got some, to be honest with you. But this was, we would affectionately call it ground snorkeling, because as dramatic as the sort of macro view is, the micro view is just, pretty spectacular. And when it would rain, a lot of those lichens would sort of soak up the water and just become so much brighter and plumper. And this is a close-up of that orange stuff, which would become quite slick when it got wet. So you actually had to really be careful, but it was just so beautiful to have these like, fluorescent colors in this otherwise, pretty shades of gray sort of landscape. This is Casey walking towards Ariel, which is one of the peaks that was not made of granite. It was a metamorphic peak, so it had a very different character as far as the actual rock goes. It wasn't this monolith of like one piece of rock. It was quite broken, and we wanted to get on this thing because you could basically walk to the top of it. It wasn't one of these sheer faces. So on a day like this, when climbing wasn't looking good, we went out for a little scramble. And this is some of the terrain that we encountered toward the top of it. We turned back a few hundred feet below the summit because we were getting into this sort of frozen dirt and ice with loose rock on it, which we didn't really feel like we had the proper gear to do with like a really low margin of error. We felt pretty comfortable, but of course we were in a cloud, so the summit view wouldn't quite have been worth fighting for, and just that small risk of like a slip being more than you bargained for didn't quite seem worth it. So it was a good chance for us to practice that sort of team communication, and be all on the same boat about what we wanted to do with our time. And it was still like really beautiful and memorable, but of course getting close to the summit is a bit tantalizing. So that was fun. This is from our descent down. You're basically on this big slope of loose rock, not loose enough that it felt unstable or anything like that, but just a very different character from this sort of really sheer granite that we were there for, basically the stuff that was really exciting to us. We spent I think 5 days, 6 days in and around this zone below the albatross, and ironically the best climbing that we did up there was this house-sized boulder that had fallen off the mountain at some point, but was so enormous that it was really hard to conceive of this thing flying through the air. And it was actually really incredible. It was covered in these really perfect cracks, which is what we like to climb on granite. And so you can see Logan's down here climbing on it, and we ended up doing a bit of climbing up some of these cracks on it. That's Logan climbing this feature here, which ended up being just really stellar quality. But of course, it was nice to be able to use our ropes and gear that we brought all the way up there, but a bit of a tease to climb something that's, you measure in tens of feet and not hundreds of feet or thousands of feet. But still really, really fun and a great activity in between rain showers. There's all of us just sort of romping up the backside, which was this low angle system of cracks that was just really fun to move around on, but not quite as dramatic as some of those other formations that we were traveling all that way to see. So after a few days, it was impressive seeing how much the topography really affects and interacts with the weather. Just hiking up into that valley, we got snow when we talked to other hikers who had camped, a couple miles back, and at slightly lower altitude, we're just getting rain. So it really, the elevation and where you were in these valleys really affected how the weather would behave. And those peaks, this was actually one of the few times that we were able to see the summit of Xanadu. Xanadu being one of the tallest features in that little cirque there, it sort of developed its own weather, and you could just watch clouds swirling around it. And it was actually fascinating to me. I don't know a lot about like meteorology, especially in the mountains, but just seeing how the clouds and the atmosphere would interact with these mountains was pretty dramatic. But after a few days, as beautiful and dramatic as the clouds were, we wanted to see a little bit more and hope that one of the lower valleys, that Aquarius Valley, might have a little bit better weather for us. So we broke camp and hiked down. Here's Toby coming out of there. Just for a refresher on so we had hiked up. This was where we had camped below Xanadu. And so we were going to hike down around the Elephant's Tooth and make camp in Aquarius Valley below these formations called the Maidens, which I had seen early on and sort of fallen in love with because they were some of the most beautiful granite formations I've ever seen. That's them in the background there. East Maiden, West Maiden, and this other one called the Camel. And those are about 2,000 feet tall and just of really like impeccable quality granite. Just, I don't know, sort of the climber's dream in a sense that they're just big. They're pretty low angle, so not super difficult climbing. But as you can see, they were covered in snow, which was not a given. But seeing that, we sort of realized that our chances of climbing on those were pretty slim, which was difficult to acknowledge. But you know, we weren't gonna try for something that wasn't looking good, of course. That's a patch of sunlight hitting the face and melting some of that snow off. But those patches of sunlight were sort of few and far between. So this is a view from below the elephant's tooth. So that was that peak on the skyline that looked quite steep from the distance, and it was pretty steep, but these things change so much in aspect, and the direction that you're looking at them really changes how they look. But we knew one of the more manageable faces to try and climb on. And so when we had a good day, we thought we'd sort of get a nice, introduction to the rock and not try and pick off something that was too ambitious and objective. But this is the face here, and we approached up this valley and scrambled up this little gully here before trying to take basically a plumb line up this face to the summit. And it ended up just being spectacular. There were so many options on the face. You can see this is my buddy Casey. We split into 2 rope teams, and we're basically able to climb in parallel to each other. There were enough crack systems and climbable terrain on there that we could just climb side by side, which is not very common. You're generally following the weakness up the face. So for there to be enough options that we could just sort of climb as 2 parties in parallel just made it really fun and festive, because you're just hollering over at your buddies who are climbing next to you. So when you were asking how much daylight? So that was a big question for me. And when we first got there, it did not get dark, which is really attractive if you're trying to climb bigger things, because the sun's not going to go down on you and you're not going to get stuck out in the dark. But being towards the tail end of the summer, we were already losing daylight so much that towards the end of our 9 days in here, we were actually getting 2 or 3 hours of darkness in the middle of the night. So it was pretty dramatic to see how fast that was shifting, but also pretty wild to get up there and wake up and be like, oh, it's probably time to get up. And you look at your watch and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and you could read a book. It did, but A, you're exhausted, like physically exhausted and mentally exhausted. And B, I just got to throwing a t-shirt over my head and going back to sleep, and that was working just fine. So as you can imagine, as you're getting higher up, you gain a pretty spectacular view. So here's Toby taking it in. He's looking pretty blissed out here. But this is looking back on Ariel in the back corner. You can see the top of the Albatross and Xanadu, but we're about even with the summit of the Albatross, and looking back at this huge ridge line. And one of the great things about that formation was that we were in between Aquarius Valley to our south and Arrigetch Valley to our north. So we were looking off to one side at those formations, the Maidens, and looking down at the creek that we had hiked in to get up there. So we basically were plumb in the center of this whole cirque, and it was just really spectacular being able to see that stuff from up there. It was probably the most attainable objective, pretty mellow by Arrigetch climbing standards, but it was basically our only summits while we were there, and we were so psyched, as you can imagine. Here's a view back on Ariel and Xanadu. When that time that we hiked up and around the backside, we got around here just below the summit, which would have been super cool to see across those passes into the next zone on the other side of them, but of course we were in a cloud anyway and couldn't see a thing. Little summit selfie with the timer on my camera. It was cool. My buddy Casey on the right hand side, he's a trekking guide, and has like a real talent for the logistics and the planning. So when he put this trip together, he was able to get together most of those logistics of how to get up there, what the plane costs, where we get dropped off, how much of a hike is it. You know, as a professional backpacking guide, he was pretty on top of like, what are the loads that we're going to be carrying, how much is feasible, would we have to cache food and go back for it. And we figured that a 9-day window was like a pretty reasonable, although a bit aggressive, to do a single carry with all of our food at once without having to go resupply. So he was really crucial on sort of the trip planning and logistics, but then he had to go guide for a month on the Pacific Crest Trail. And he said, I can't fill the team. We've got this trip. It's all basically lined up, but the people he invited fell through, and I was the only one that was interested that was still on board. So he said, if you can fill the trip, then we can go. And that was sort of a huge amount of trust for him to put in me, because there's a lot of communication and trust that has to go into something like this, with the sort of, you know, potential consequences and whatnot. And my buddies, Toby and Logan, Logie and Tobin, as we started calling them later on, were psyched. And I knew that I could vouch for their sort of skill set and personalities. And so Casey showed up, and here are two guys he's never met, and we're about to go off on one of the bigger adventures of our lives together. And I was so pleased when everybody got along all right, because that was not necessarily a given. But that was quite the treat. And I think we all came away from it pretty good friends. And just watching the light change from up on the summit, looking down at the creek, all these little details just come into focus, and we were just ecstatic to catch some of those views. I don't remember what the minerals are that cause it, but a lot of the glacial runoff will cause these like teal blue ponds and pools up there. So that's another part of this sort of psychedelic looking color scheme of these teal blues and the, you know, fluorescent oranges of the lichens that made quite the color palette. So this is looking south towards the Maidens from the summit of the Elephant's Tooth. So you can get a bit of the scale. So we read that you could walk off of the summit of the Elephant's Tooth, which ended up being about as memorable as the climbing itself. So we climbed further out on this face, up through this steeper section here to the summit, and then we're able to scramble down this ridge line, which I don't know if I got any real good pictures of that, but it was beautiful. But also you're looking at like pretty big drop on either side of you as you're on this thin ridge. And that was definitely one of the more exciting moments of the climb. I find it pretty relaxing when you've got a rope on you, but when you're just sort of walking on not difficult but very exposed terrain, it adds a little bit of excitement to the process. And that's sort of what we discovered was a lot of the style, not a lot of really difficult climbing, but just sort of big, exposed, sometimes a lot of loose rock, which makes it sort of demanding psychologically. This is another feature we had looked at. This is called the parabola that we'll see from a different angle. But you can get on top of this shoulder and walk along this ridge until it slowly turns from sort of walking to scrambling to climbing. And so you can just follow this ridge to the summit there. That was one of the objectives that we were sort of licking our chops over if we were going to get a weather window. And then looking down, you start to get a little bit of the scale, because even though we only climbed, you know, maybe 500 feet of technical rock climbing, you know, you ascend, you know, 1,000, 1,500 feet of slope to get there. So by the time you actually take the rope out, you've got a nice view, which you of course get to descend again, feeling like you got something done for the day. And that's Logan carrying the ropes there. Just having him along to explain what are these like ridiculous geological formations that we're seeing, like these limestone squiggles that he couldn't quite explain, but you see a lot of this like really crazy geology that a lot of which we would have no idea about, but he could point us in the right direction for how that came to be. But it made for some fun hiking and scrambling around. So this is us just enjoying a snack as we put away our gear. You can see this is just looking up at the face that we climbed. We followed it up through this gully here and then got up onto this face. And that was our walk off from the summit down this little ridge and then back down into this basin here. This is one of our dinner spots. So yeah, like we were saying, like even without doing a ton of climbing, we could see why other people would go through all that effort just to walk around. You get some pretty dramatic camp and dinner spots. You can see our bear canisters where we had everything all together to make a meal, and then we would stash those away from camp again. But we ended up eating pretty well, which was not always guaranteed. It's hard you got to map out each day's meals and how much each person is gonna eat for each meal. Some of us had faster metabolisms than others. So we got to work out, maybe we don't split it quite equally, and that ended up working fine. But this is Aquarius Valley where we were hoping we might have slightly better weather. But we ended up doing a lot of this drizzly hiking again, which was, of course, not climbing like we were hoping, but still quite spectacular.
How many calories a day do you figure you need?
I didn't add it up, and that's a good question. But Toby and I ended up eating more, more than our buddies. A lot of like high fat and protein content stuff, because it's just quite strenuous. I should have put that together. I'm curious to know how many calories I was burning a day. You can see the dusting of snow that we got on some of these, and we got some as an antler. They're pretty large. There's big caribou herds that move around the Brooks Range. I don't think they all travel together as a big herd, but that's one of the big, fauna, groups, and also a really big source of food for some of the native people that have called the Brooks Range home for a long time. And it was actually really interesting learning a little bit more about the region and the people and the politics. There's actually a proposed road that will cut through the national park to access some open pit copper mines that are proposed by the state of Alaska and some private enterprise that would really seriously interrupt the caribou migration and like the main source of food for some of the, I think, Inupiat people that live up there. So we got to learn about some of that stuff, which was fascinating and of course a little depressing, but not necessarily set in stone yet. But we just mostly were walking around looking for cracks to climb, even if we weren't quite getting the conditions. Those binoculars ended up being really crucial, just for looking at features that we wanted to climb. One of which was on this formation called the Camel. And from these cracks down here, there's a crack system that laced its way much of the way up this face that we spent a lot of time drooling over, hoping we get a chance to climb on. But you can see just how much sort of texture goes into some of these formations and how many different options. And we spent a lot of time discussing what might be a good climbing option, because unlike a place like Yosemite Valley, which is similar in scale and the amount of exposed granite out there, in a place like that, every climbing route is documented with its difficulty and features and how it's equipped to descend or something like that. Up here, when we had information about what a climb was, it was generally like someone has climbed the north face of this peak, and that's about all the detail you get. So there's a lot of this sort of investigation that we would have to do ourselves of what looked good, what looked like the line that we would want to climb, and what would be our strategy for how we would want to both get to the top and also get back down again. which is part of the adventure with this type of climbing, because it can take you, hours to ascend the peak, and you want to get down ideally without leaving too much gear behind that you would be rappelling off of. You ideally want to take everything with you and not leave trash up in the mountains. And part of it is trying to do it in good style. And what climbers call good style is, a way that you're proud of, because you could, drill bolts, all the whole way up there, but that doesn't really seem like much of an accomplishment as doing it clean and not leaving behind metal and trash in the mountains. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So where it's darker, that's generally because there's lichen growing on it. And the lighter stuff, this is where the slope is wearing away and eroding below it. So the ground used to be higher. This is more recently exposed granite, and that's the color of it. And the stuff that's been exposed to the moisture in the atmosphere is covered in black lichen, which is actually slowly digesting the surface of the rock.
Can you climb in the dark stuff, or
You can, but you get to know the different types of lichen. Some of the lichen, like where you can see here, it's a little bit shinier. That's where more active water seeping is happening. And with the most active water seeps, there can be enough lichen that when it's wet, it can be quite slick. So the surface of the rock, the friction, the texture, all very much contributes to your climbing experience and what's possible, what's safe, what's easy, and what's not easy. You can see over here, there's this sort of golden hue to some of the rock up there. And that is actually just the granite itself, but you can see from some of the like darker streaks, those are water streaks where more water is coming down and letting the lichen and stuff like that grow on it. That's a good question. So here's actually a great example. You can see some of these vertical streaks, which mostly have to do with how much water is running over the surface of the rock. So here's another view of the rock glacier up in Aquarius Valley. I would have, just guessed that this is just all rock, but then you get these little windows into it, and you find that it's actually a glacier that's covered in rocks. And it's all quite active. For some granite areas that we climb in, when you're walking around on these slopes of rock that's all sort of shed off of the mountains, they're generally pretty stable because they're not moving that quickly. But with all the glacial activity, and I believe this is actually a geologically young range, that these formations haven't been exposed for too terribly long, a lot of these slopes were actually pretty active. And so, generally, if you see a big rock, it's your own. That's Logan right there. If you see a big rock, there's a good chance that it's not going to move. But we found that we had to sort of adjust that being up here because a lot of the rocks would still be pretty unstable. And you can imagine that a rock the size of your body or bigger could pretty easily crush your foot if it were to shift underneath you. So that was sort of part of our, how we would get used to moving safely in this terrain, was like trusting how stable a slope would be when you want to cross a bunch of loose rock. And, we'd be hiking all around this zone. And that was, really, really fun to get to explore. But of course, it was the vertical rock that we had our eyes on. And as you can see with the sort of dusting of snow, it was getting pretty regular precipitation. That was one of the things that we learned from Dirk, our pilot. A lot of this zone in the Brooks Range was actually classified as alpine desert. It gets quite a small amount of annual precipitation. So not very good skiing in the winter, despite a long and cold winter. But he was telling us that largely because of climate change, they've been seeing as much as like 4 or 5 times their annual average for precipitation in the past few years. So we didn't know if it was a fluke system that was blowing through when we were up there, or if this is sort of the new normal. But we were getting actually quite a lot of precipitation, which didn't bode well for our climbing, but I thought made for pretty good pictures with the misty peaks and whatnot. Some more views looking down the valley there. Toby thankfully wore a bright orange jacket. Logan and Casey wore black and green jackets, which I was much less supportive of. Don't quite pop out as much in the pictures. I know, then you get lost in the lichen, which is not, it was a backfire I did not see coming. So this was a tower that Casey thought would be really cool to climb. To access it, of course, you'd need to get up, at least 1,000 feet of pretty steep terrain. But just the acreage of exposed rock up there leaves one with a lot of potential climbs to think about, especially when you can't climb. You do a lot of the thinking and the eating. Toby and I were the ones with the faster metabolisms, like I said. So we ended up eating a lot of these sort of high protein granola bar type snacks while we were out on the move, because it was pretty dramatic. You could feel your body get a lot colder when you run out of calories, and all you have to do is have a quick snack and suddenly you're back in action. So this formation behind him is Parabola. So that is the mountain that from the other side, from the Elephant's Tooth, we were looking at with that big sloping ridge that gradually steepens. So this is looking at the front side of the face, and it's got these tiered peaks. And we spent a lot of time looking at this just because we thought it was a really beautiful formation. But also, you have one very steep face on the south aspect, and then the much more approachable ridge line on the northern aspect. So, Logan was coming from a more big wall approach, which is much more slow going, going up a steeper face, whereas Casey likes to do these sort of ridge climbs, which you're moving much more quickly, often without ropes because you're on much more secure terrain. So it was cool to have climbers with different expertise and backgrounds discussing different ways of approaching an objective like that. And people got more excited about one style or another. So that was a lot of fun, getting to sort of mix some of our experience and perspectives on those things.
What's your altitude?
Pretty low, pretty low. The summits of the highest peaks in that little range are about 7,000 feet. So we were hanging out around 4,000. So it was amazing how much, like I said, the weather would be affected by that elevation change, even though it's like you're not super high up there. It's not like we're in the Himalayas. I was coming from Flagstaff, which is town is at 7,000 feet. So I was used to, it's not like the air was thin for us, but it was amazing how much the small elevation changes that you could cover in, an hour would change. Could you see? Maybe you're up in the cloud ceiling and you can't see anything, but you drop a few hundred feet and you can, you're underneath the cloud ceiling. Oh yeah, well that's good. So this is just a view of the north face of Parabola and those tiered peaks. It's a lot of us just pointing up at things with binoculars. That was like our main activity, yeah. Our second activity was climbing the smaller things, and much like we had the big boulder in Arrigetch Valley to climb on, we found some bouldering to do. And it feels a little bit silly to go bouldering, which is climbing these short rocks when you're in these, cathedrals of skyscrapers. But in between drizzles, we'd find a dry face, and you can see that the lighter parts get less water runoff. And so we found some pretty fun bouldering to entertain ourselves. I think this one we were bouldering because Casey had forgotten his camera up high up on top of that glacier and had a couple miles to scramble all the way back up there to where we had snacked earlier, a few hours earlier, find his camera and to come back down. So we entertained ourselves by bouldering for a little while. And after that drizzle, the sort of lichen came alive, and that was a particularly beautiful day. and we got to look across, and those bands are limestone, which is just, deposited crustaceans, ancient seabed. And so that is sort of the geological backdrop, and the pluton, which is the magma bubble that rises up through the crust, creating these big granite towers. Those are like magma bubbles rising up, would displace those, and you could actually see those horizontal ridge lines, or horizontal bands of limestone suddenly curving and jutting up as the granite from underneath would push it up. All of that happening millions of years ago, deep underneath the inside the crust of the earth. So having the geologist on board was great. And then, of course, when we're packing up on our very last day, beautiful sunshine comes popping out. We're like wishing we're like, maybe we should just hike out all night, not sleep tonight, and go climbing. But it ended up being kind of nice to dry out our gear before packing it up. Oh, we got the rainbows popping. It was gorgeous. Yeah, sun's out, guns out, just enjoying it. We're watching the snow melt off some of these faces, trying to justify climbing when we really should start hiking. But of course the sun, it wasn't getting dark until 11:30 at night anyway, so we would hike into the night anyway. Get to the gravel bar and find our cache of food still there, which was great. So we got a whole bunch of food that we could eat while we were waiting for the plane to come pick us up. And of course, weather conditions permitted, so we had to know that we could get down there and the weather could be impassable for the small plane, and we could have to wait a couple days or more for him to come get us. It's a shot that my buddy Raja, who we met heading in, took of us as we were sitting there just destroying the rest of our food supplies. But we're looking pretty fat and happy, which we were very pleased to be feeling pretty good coming out of there. That's basically the end of what I got prepared. So happy to field any questions, of course.
How did you train?
How did we train? Well, Casey was in great shape. Casey on the right there was coming off of a backpacking trip, so his legs were super fit. And the rest of us were trying to just go out and climb and carry backpacks uphill, because you're the basic activity that you're going to be doing. No sense doing something else. You want to be doing what you're going to be doing on the trip. So climbing uphill with backpacks. Realistically, none of us were going to shoulder an 80-pound pack. Just doesn't sound that fun. And Logan, who's seated next to Casey there, was finishing research for his master's thesis. So he was actually mostly sitting at a computer staring at a screen and not feeling very well trained up, but he did just fine. And I think on our hike in with our heaviest packs, we were averaging about a mile per hour. So stopping every quarter mile or so to, let the blood flow back into our shoulders where our backpack straps were pressing and rest our legs. So we made pretty slow progress, which, is to be expected, I guess. I don't think any of us went too crazy with the training.
How far was the hike again?
From
drop off to your first.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly, but I think about 12 miles. And we did not end up making it to our proposed camp spot the first night. I think we made maybe 10 miles the first day, which took us most of the day. Well, we got in probably around noon, so the afternoon. But we had to finish that hike to our first intended camp spot the next day. Yeah. Well, thank y'all for coming.